Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 16. Washington's goal to place him in the rear guard did not work, for there had been an unexpected shift from the British troops, and now muskets and cannonballs were all over. Do not be stunned and faint, he thought to himself over and over, even though the crashing and screams and explosions of the battlefield made it difficult for him to stay focused. The ragged colonial troops were like a dark ocean spreading across the land, whereas the British troops reminded him of a smear of blood, like one might leave when sliding down a wall. The battle took a sort of hazy quality to it, as if in a dream, although the screams and sounds of musket and cannon fire reminded him all too clearly of how real it was. And then there was the smell. He could never dream a smell so horrible. He would know the smell of gunpowder and rot and shit and blood anywhere. But he had promised Lawrence not to die, and he had been permitted to be on the field of battle, and that would have to be enough. He could not break such a promise or throw away such a chance. He shot, and he avoided the stab of a bayonet, and he reloaded his musket on sheer habit, and then he shot again and avoided another charge. The battle was chaos. He was in a blurry hell, powered only by the instinctual actions of a soldier and his own adrenaline. Even if he had not been dogged by the stubborn remains of his fever that the battle brought to the forefront, he would hardly be able to keep track of their men or the surging red troops. He managed a clear sight of a man in red and, in a slowed motion of hyper-focus, raised his musket. The recoil of it snapped against his shoulder and brought him crisply back to reality. "On one!" He knew that voice and was commanded by it. He looked up and saw the general, saber raised, horse reared. Even if only for a second, the visual took his breath away. The horse charged, and Alexander was drawn to it like a magnet. The startled British men diving out of the way of striking hooves were easy targets for his saber, and he cut them down without seeing them. "Bonjour!" He knew that voice too. "Vive la Revolution!" And more storming of hooves as Lafayette hurled past him, laughing maniacally. A musket raised, but Alexander saw it before a shot could fell his friend. His own rang first. The man dropped. "Merci!" Lafayette yelled over his shoulder. "Have you seen Lawrence?" he yelled at the Frenchman. Lawrence had been assigned away from him, and thought of his man in this chaos felt like a weight clamped directly out of his heart. "Oui!" Lafayette ducked a bullet and pointed with his saber. Some of the weight lifted from Alexander's chest. "Save your Lawrence!" He laughed and took off, kicking up bloody snow like a dust cloud. Alexander allowed himself a smile before he headed off in the direction indicated. A cannonball crashed somewhere nearby, sending him flying and covered him in a pile of snow and gore. He hit the frozen ground in a dazed heap and tried to make sense of what his body was telling him. His shoulder and hip had taken the brunt of the impact, and they throbbed painfully. The sudden cold all around him shattered his concentration. He staggered to his feet. His eye caught the glint of metal in the snow. His saber. He retrieved it, shaking the stun from his hand, and then noticed his musket on the ground. The weapon would be useless damp, but he slung it over his shoulder nonetheless. Lawrence. He needed to find Lawrence. He groaned as he wiped the snow from his eyes. His hand came away red, but it was cold. Someone else's blood. He smeared it away with his sleeve as if to stop it from freezing on his face. He did a mental check as he dragged his feet away. He drew his hands down his body. Something warm. His left side. He took a deep breath and felt a sharp stab of pain. He closed his eyes and prayed, then did a cursory examination of where his uniform had been slit open. It was a surface wound. Nothing had entered. He took a breath. The pain cleared his mind of fog. The battle roared, distracting him from the wound. It pulsed and thrummed around him like a monster's heartbeat. It reached like claws to keep him from his Lawrence. It saw his promise, and it sought to snap it like a fishbone. He could not let that happen. He spat cold blood out of his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut to maintain a little discipline and forced his feet to move forwards. Lawrence. He had to find his Lawrence. Where was he? Which direction had Lafayette pointed? He had not made Lawrence promise him not to die. Fear gave him speed. It wrapped around his heart like a quilt and made him feel like he was suffocating. It powered him as he searched through the corpses and the injured. None were Lawrence. His eye caught movements in the distance. They were winning! The battle was easing, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the moaning of men around him. The British were retreating. The Continental Army was moving forward. They were pressing the attack. "Catch the tails!" Washington's voice roared from somewhere. He had to do what he was commanded, despite that his heart pounded and throbbed to the beat of Lawrence's name. His feet moved without him thinking. Forward. They were to go forward, so he must go forward. The voice filled him and overpowered everything else. It provided a new source of energy, something that he could feed on. With the command, he was unstoppable and indestructible. He ran, drawing on the rally for energy, following the sight of Washington's jacket. Redcoats were obstacles to be dispatched. He drew his saber and slashed, forgetting everything but the battle. He could hear the squelch as he stepped in a puddle of melted snow and blood. It seemed like the battle had stopped all of a sudden, as he parried one last slash and then stabbed, trying to block out the scream of agony his opponent let out. The man moaned as he fell, but Alexander could not pay attention to him. He had to carry on. He took a deep breath of the stinking air. Despite the sharp cold, all he could smell was blood and rot. He staggered away from the fallen British men, looking around, trying to get his bearings. He wiped off the bloody saber on his dirt-stained breeches and slid it back into the sheath. He had to walk. He had to find Lawrence. His Lawrence was still out there somewhere in this miserable hell. His pulse pounded in his eyes next to his ringing ears remaining from the cannon fire. One foot in front of another. He was born to march. The power of Washington's rally left him as suddenly as it had arrived. It left a gaping void that just as quickly filled up with his familiar friend, exhaustion. He did not know how long he could move. He staggered to his knees and vomited up nothing. Blackness crept into his vision from all sides. All around him the moans of the dying seemed to have a hypnotic, lulling effect. The dead and dying were calling to him to be one of their ranks. He could not listen to their song. He forced himself back onto his feet and looked around. It was hard to identify anything in particular. Somehow the world reminded him of a painting. There had been a man who lived down the street from them on St. Croix who had been a painter. He had painted the ocean and the beach. The hurricane had killed him. Perhaps if that man had gone mad with pain and suffering, he could draw this. Perhaps if the devil reached out from the hell they stood on and touched the man, this is what he would paint. "Stand up, Hamilton! Do not faint!" He admonished himself sharply and stood. He took one step in front of another. He glanced at the men on the ground like puzzle pieces. He forced himself to look at each one. That one was not Lawrence. This one was not Lawrence. "Mon ami!" A set of strong shoulders found themselves under his arm and lifted him more completely to his feet, more dragging him than anything. He could not see the man. He could only see the dead and the snow. My Lawrence," he muttered, forcing himself to help. Step, step, step. "Where? My Lawrence, I promise. We will find your heart, Alexander." He was shaken gently, and it roused the darkness out of his vision. "We must away. Be awake, man, walk!" He took the stumbling steps ordered of him. He could not stop searching the faces. He did not know where they went or how long they walked. It seemed like forever in the dull haze of his mind. He felt desperately weak. The cold crept in on all sides like a familiar storm. He could see it in the distance. The hurricane winds, the hailstones. His wound burned like fire, and the cloth froze his sweaty skin and pulled when he moved. He was placed against a tree. He had no energy to compete against it. "There is your Lawrence," the man said, and then fled into the after-battle hellscape. "My," Alexander said, and he turned his head. "Yes." "Lawrence!" he cried, a burst of adrenaline flooding through him all at once. The man's eyes were closed, and all of a sudden a dark terror bloomed in his chest like a sunflower. No. No. Desperation powered him. He groped at Lawrence's bloody coat and gave him a good shake. "What in God's name, man?" Lawrence croaked, and the sound sounded like a choir of angels. Lawrence saw him right then, and his eyes went wide and flung both arms around Alexander's body, squeezing him hard enough to set up aches all over. It was a wonderful pain, despite their grime, despite the sweat and cold. "My Alexander," Lawrence said into his ear, and gave him an inch back so they could look at each other. He brought one hand up to touch Lawrence's grease-smeared cheek, the other sliding around his neck. He pressed a gentle kiss to those lips. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care what happened after this moment. They were both still alive, and he was here with his Lawrence. "I love you," Lawrence said against his mouth, hands desperately folded into his collar. "Are you injured at all?" Alexander traced his hands over Lawrence's face and stared at him. "Nothing serious. I have been cut, but not dangerously. I am merely very tired and very sore. So I am as I have been forever, it seems. And you, my Lawrence?" "I am marvelous now that you have appeared." Lawrence smiled at him, and Alexander was helpless to do anything but smile back. He had the forethought to look around them this time before kissing Lawrence again. The world narrowed to soft lips and the warmth of the other man's mouth. When they split, he moved. He slid one arm around Lawrence's waist, keeping him close. Just the weight of the man next to him allowed him to relax. Lawrence slid an arm around his shoulders and heaved a heavy sigh, relaxing against the tree they shared. He stared without thinking at the setting sun. Alexander pressed a kiss to his cheek and leaned against his shoulder, closing his eyes and trying to filter the sights and sounds of battle from his mind. Instead of the dying screams of men, he imagined Lawrence's laughter. Instead of the heat of spilling blood, it was the warmth of Lawrence's skin. Instead of the flash of the muzzle barrel and the shine of steel, it was the sight of his man smiling. Even in a miserable landscape like this, being with Lawrence seemed heavenly. "Can you stand, my Hamilton?" Lawrence asked him after some time. "We should return to camp, or try to at least rendezvous with Lafayette or the general." "Yes, I think so," Hamilton replied. With reluctance, he withdrew his hand from around Lawrence's waist. He used the tree to stand, and although his feet were unsteady, they seemed to work. He looked down at the bloodied area of his jacket where shrapnel had grazed him, but he was more irritated than concerned. "It is not serious. Should you not go to Lee?" he said, noting Lawrence's frown. "If you insist, though I will pay more care to you when we return. As for General Lee, I am sure he will not be far from Washington's side." "Hopefully he has gotten dreadfully lost, so you will only be able to attend to my wound when we return to camp." Lawrence laughed. "Scoundrel," he said with an affection that pushed light into Alexander's frozen fingers. They began to walk. "Lawrence," he said suddenly, "I want you to promise me—" "Shh, Alexander, just this once. Let me pretend the man that has forced me to desire him will occasionally grant me a moment of silence," Lawrence said. They stopped to rest. They had come to the top of a little foothill on the outskirts of the true battlefield. There were no dead or dying men around him, and the smell in the air had petered out to only a faint stench of iron and gunpowder. The crisp cold offered a familiar sting, but Alexander found it suddenly tolerable, with Lawrence standing next to him. The setting sun chilled him, but it turned the sky an extraordinary color of orange, like the very planet was lighting a bonfire for their cause. It reminded him of... Alexander turned to look at Lawrence, who was staring at the sun in silence. He was beautiful, Alexander decided. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what it might be like to stare out on the green French countryside with Lawrence and Eliza and Lafayette, and at the whim he intertwined Lawrence's grimy fingers with his own. Lawrence squeezed his hand. The moment felt irreplaceable and isolated. Theirs. Their eye of the storm that was this war. Yellow sky and all. Alexander wished he could summon a painter to this spot, and he would hang the painting of this moment on his mantle to be looked at every possible opportunity. Instead, he stared across the horizon, promising himself to never forget. "You have run off!" Lafayette yelled from the foot of their little hill, startling Lawrence bad enough that he jumped. Alexander snorted and grinned at the Frenchman as he strode up the incline. "Good God, Lafayette, I have survived an intense battle, and surely the heart palpitations you give me should be my death," Lawrence grumbled. Lafayette, who looked as ragged and disgusting as the both of them, rolled his eyes. "Presuming you both suffer no more grievous wounds worse than a bad fright, the general wishes to review the battle and the possible actions next to be taken. I would not advise to keep him waiting. Certainly you know how he can become upset in such an event." "Yes, we are aware," Alexander answered. He took a deep breath and put the moment in his heart, locking it there forever. He shifted and winced as his undershirt rubbed at the cut at his side. "Come, my Lawrence, Lafayette, Let us face the next challenge of this great war together. Independence still awaits us. Lafayette smiled and offered a little bow, then turned and walked back down the hill, leading them. Alexander managed one more brief kiss of his orange lips, and they began the long walk back to camp, ready to withstand the other half of the storm. End of Ocular by Iniquity. If you enjoyed this recording or the content, feel free to leave a comment below or a review at the original story from the link in the descriptions. Thank you for listening.